Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Corporate Social Responsibility and Citizenship. Let's go ahead and talk about the key learning objectives. So there are 7 here. We're going to be understanding the role of big business and the responsible use of corporate power in a democratic society. So talking about large organizations in this chapter. We're going to be talking about knowing when the idea of social responsibility originated and investigating how a company's purpose or mission can integrate social objectives with economic and legal objectives, right? That social responsibility is a new thing in the past 20 years. Number 3, we'll be examining the key arguments in support of and concerns about corporate responsibility, the pros and the cons, in other words. Number 4, we'll be defining corporate citizenship and recognizing the rapidly evolving management practices to support global citizenship. Because as I said, this is a new idea in the past 20 years. So managers are still grappling with it, deciding how it is that they'd like to manage this space. Number 5, we'll be examining businesses with an explicitly social mission, such as social ventures and B corporations. I'm sure many of you have heard of Warby Parker or Tom's Shoes or Goodwill Industries. And 6, we'll be distinguishing among the sequential stages of global corporate citizenship. Boston College came out with a really nice the sequential stages and how an organization can move through these stages. And lastly, we'll be understanding how business can assess and report their social performance. So let's go ahead and get into it. First, we're going to talk about corporate power and responsibility. This is the capability of corporations to influence government, the economy, and society based on their organizational resources. So, right, when we talk about organizational resources, we talk about supplies, we talk about governance, we talk about products that they create. This tremendous power of the world's leading corporations has both, right, a positive and a negative effect. And so we're going to be talking about that a lot in our case study with gravity here in class. The positive thing is that organizations have an amazing amount of resources, right? So Michelin Tires has an amazing source of rubber, right? Apple Computers has an amazing source of metals and chips and programmers. And that because they have so many resources, they can also lower their production costs, right? Because they have so many products going out, they can order in bulk. They have new products that they're creating, and they have access to technologies that smaller businesses might not have. So, for example, that they gave in the book, right? UPS was able to bring healthcare products to towns and villages in Africa using their drone product, as opposed to trucks and buses and trains that are the traditional way of distribution, right? That maybe smaller organizations are more in control of, but because UPS has such a large network and is so established with their drone business, they're able to make things more efficient. But it's not always good, right? There's some negative points to having corporate power being responsible for these initiatives. So the first one is the disproportionate political influence, right? So that's where we talk about lobbyists. As we talked about in the Uber case, right? They hired some lobbyists to go and then influence the government bills that they wanted to have come through for their favor, right? Uber didn't want to pay super high premiums for these new insurance products that were being imposed on them. So they hired lobbyists then to negotiate with the government to bring the premiums down and to bring the insurance packages down, right? And is that really the best thing for society? The next negative thing is a dominant public course. So very often the large organizations get the biggest spotlight, they get all of the attention, and they get a lot of power in what they say and what they do. They can also divide markets, and they can squash competitions. So one of the things that the book brought up was that just 100 companies supposedly are the source of 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a statistic from 2017, right? And so these large organizations are responsible for so much damage at the end of the day. So is that really right? Or how do we mitigate that? And that's what this chapter is all about. So to talk more about the power that some of these large organizations have, this chart here compares the size of a particular organization with the size of a country. So Walmart, for example, has the same same size economy as the country of Belgium. So you can see the number of billions of sales and then in dollars. And then this is the gross domestic product, also in billions of dollars from 2006 to 2007. So around the same year, right? So if we talk about China, National Petroleum, they create $263 billion in sales, and the whole country of Chile creates $263 billion in their gross domestic product, right? So all of the work that Chile does for the whole entire year only totals up to what China does in one particular business, right? So as you can see, as you go through here, it's amazing to see these organizations that we're so familiar with. Costco, right, with what many of you go to or many of your parents, has the same number of sales as the country of Kuwait. BMW, Ukraine, and Wells Fargo. If you bank at Wells Fargo, did you realize how powerful Wells Fargo is potentially, right? They have as much money in sales as the whole country of Ecuador. So we're going to talk about now the corporate power of and responsibility. There's something called the iron law of responsibility. And this says that in the long run, those who do not use power in ways that society considers responsible will tend to lose it. And sometimes when we read this, this might think of like a karmic thing, you know, like if you don't do the right thing, someone will come back and get you. But actually, in society today, there is a person who's going to come back and get you. Those are stakeholders. Stakeholders these days expect businesses to take care of society. And so what happens when these stakeholders expect these businesses to take care of society, it develops into what's called corporate social responsibility. So what is this true meaning of corporate social responsibility? This is acting in a way that enhances society and its inhabitants and where the corporation can be accountable. The corporation acknowledges any harm to people in society and correct it if possible. Right now, I'm thinking of product recalls, right? Tylenol had that huge product recall many, many years ago, and they spent millions of dollars of pulling Tylenol off the shelf because supposedly a couple of bottles were found to have poison in them, and a couple people died. So they corrected that. The last thing is here, corporate social responsibility may forego some profits. The organization may forego some profits if its social impacts hurt its stakeholders or if its funds is usable for a positive social impact. And so we're going to talk about this again in the Gravity case, right? That there was a point in time when the Gravity CEO, right, was living on almost rice and beans because he agreed to pay his employees a minimum wage of $70,000. And so that takes his wage down. And he was still figuring out how all of that was going to work. And that was at the beginning. So now he's kind of more streamlined this, and he's gotten a lot of great attention for his efforts. But when it first started, we didn't really know if the CEO and if the organization was going to be sustainable. So let's talk about corporate citizenship. This is where the actions they take to put their commitments to corporate social responsibility into practice. The term global corporate citizenship similarly refers to putting these commitments into practice worldwide. And the companies demonstrate their corporate citizenship by proactively building stakeholder partnerships, right? And so if you are an organization that emits greenhouse gases, you definitely want to partner with organizations that are, for the environment, are petitioning for these environmental issues. The next one is demonstrating a corporate citizenship by discovering business opportunities and serving society. So we're going to talk about Nestle here today, about how they did a very large research project and help parents better understand the best nutrition for children. And the last one is transforming a concern for financial performance into a vision of integrated financial and social performance. So let's go ahead and talk about all of these three in a little bit. We're going to, before we get to the example, let's first talk about the orange of corporate social responsibility. So the United States, the idea of corporate social responsibility appeared around the start of the 20th century. This is when I was graduating business school. I finished in 2003, and as you'll get to know, I have a good friend, Shannon, who started her business then because she was really passionate about organizations helping the environment. And now she's a very successful career coach in helping other people find jobs as corporate social responsibility leaders within these organizations. So she was at the beginning of this and had a really nice career in helping other people do this. So corporations under attack, corporations came under the attack of being too big, too powerful, and guilty of antisocial and anti-competitive practices. And to use their power and influence voluntarily for broad social purposes rather than for profits alone. So we have an example from a long time ago, right? A few decades ago, right? Maker Andrew Carnegie, he gave much of his wealth in the end from steel to educational institutions, right? That's why, and the arts as well. That's why we have Carnegie Hall in New York, and many buildings and within the universities are named after Andrew Carnegie. Same thing for Henry Ford, right? He made all of his money in the car industry, but he ended up giving it back for philanthropic ideas. And so now we have these new philanthropists, right? Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chen, they've created this whole foundation. And that the nice thing is that now, 20 years later, charitable giving is much more popular than in previous generations, right? If you were to ask your grandparents, for example, if their organization was involved in charitable giving, chances are it would have been very limited. We'll go in this chapter as well and go back into that history further and look how that has all evolved. But the best person who does this, who puts this all in a bigger picture, is this William C. Frederick. He's one of the co-authors of this textbook, and he provides this expanded framework for understanding the evolution of this CSR concept. And while, yes, it started primarily in the early 2000s, there was a hint of it earlier. So if you do ask your grandparents, if they don't recognize that term, corporate social responsibility, they might recognize a term called social stewardship in the 50s and 60s. We're going to go into these four stages deeper in just a minute. They might recognize this term, corporate social responsiveness, and then more recently, corporate and business ethics, which is what the title of our course is. And then finally, we now have evolved to speaking about corporate and global citizenship. And why this course is really titled Business Ethics is because we also talk about, besides corporate social responsibility, we go back to the root of the ethics decisions behind a lot of these CSR management decisions. So here are these evolving phases of corporate social responsibility. CSR 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as you can see here, the first phase, the social stewardship, talked about corporate philanthropy, acts of charity. This is Henry Ford, Carnegie. The managers were starting to be recognized as public figures, not just people who worked within his organization and were known within an organization itself. They became trustee stewards. So people started to build trusts and guide and manage these trusts of money that would be eventually given to a nonprofit organization. And then there was a balancing of social pressure, right? That not just society or nonprofit organizations needed to take care of these, or government need to take care of these social ideas, but organizations do as well. So I won't go through all of these, but I thought they were super interesting. You can see here that the drivers are executive conscious, company image and reputation. We'll talk about that a lot in this chapter. And then the policy instruments here were just philanthropic funding and some good PR, right? The public relations agent was able to send out a memo saying that Henry Ford has now donated $1 million or $2 to this and this organization. As we move forward here, the next phase is here corporate. There's a misspelling here. Corporate social responsiveness. There's a social impact analysis that people were doing, strategic priority for social response, organizational redesign and training for responsiveness now. This is in the 1960s. Actually sounds pretty progressive, right? This wasn't very popular, but they were starting to now identify that there was a need for organizations to partake in society. And some stakeholder mapping started, which we did at the beginning of this course. Then we went to this next stage in the 80s and the 90s. We fostered an ethical corporate culture. So now, right, companies like IBM, for example, my dad was a consultant for IBM in the 1980s, and he would go to their different headquarters, mostly in upstate New York. And when they laid off a lot of companies, because there was a slight recession in the 80s, they were laying off like a few hundred employees. He was a career counselor, and they gave the employees free career counseling for, I think it was just a couple of days or a week, in order to edit their resumes, fine-tune their interviewing skills, to help them get their next job, right? So this was an example of fostering an ethical corporate culture and establishing an ethical organizational climate, right? That they weren't just, IBM wasn't so, yes, they were concerned about their bottom line, obviously, because they were somehow losing money and they needed to lay off a lot of people, but they were also looking out for all of society and not just letting these people go, but helping to take care of them once they got released. And obviously, we were recognizing ethical principles. And now, today, 1990s to the present, stakeholder partnerships, key point. We talk about that a lot in this course, right? If you're a manager in an organization, you need to know who your stakeholders are so that you can create a partnership with all of them. You want to integrate financial, social, and environmental performance, identify globalization impacts, and sustainability of company and the environment. So we'll talk a lot about that. And just to go through here, the CSR drivers for today, global economic trade and investment. So that the that the world is looking at you, and that people really want organizations to do well. High-tech communication networks, right? This is also back to that UPS example. So we have the tools, we have the knowledge to give back to places that are less developed that might need our help. There are geopolitical shifts and competition, ecological awareness and concern, right? People know a lot more about the forests in Latin America that are going away very, very quickly because of the paper products that we need around the world. And then, of course, there are NGO pressures. So again, back to those stakeholders, the nonprofit organizations create a lot of pressure for the for-profit organizations. And the instruments that we use today are intergovernmental. So there are guidelines that the different parts of the government create that organizations need to follow, like the LEED. If you're building a house or a factory or a building, that are incentives to make this a LEED building, which means it was created with products that are better for the environment over other products. There's also the global audit standards, the NGO dialogue, and sustainability audits and reports. So this goes back to the UN SDGs and the things that we'll be studying here at the end of the semester with our Aim to Flourish project. Right, the Paris Treaty, things like this. Okay, let's go ahead and keep moving. So now we're going to be balancing multiple responsibilities, right? That there are three main responsibilities of a business: the economic responsibilities, right, to make some money; the social responsibilities to help society and prolong sustainability in this world; and then legal responsibilities, right? We want to make sure that we're doing everything legally and and by the rules of the country. So the challenge is to really balance all three, and and a successful firm is one which finds ways to meet each of its critical responsibilities and develop strategies to enable the obligations to help each other. And so that's again what we'll be talking about a lot in this course, is how a manager can help combine these different responsibilities. And there was a nice quote in the textbook from a manager at UBS, the large bank out of Switzerland, where he's saying that yes, that as an organization, his mantra is to make sure that he balances all of these responsibilities, and it's not just about economic responsibilities as it was many years ago. So there's also enlightened self-interest. And this is that example about Nestle. So let's read what this is. Enlightened self-interest is where economic and social goals come together in companies that practice enlightened self-interest. The company's self-interest in the long term to provide true value to its customers and help for its employees to grow and behave responsibly. So this example about Nestle is where they invested a huge amount of money over, I think, 10 or 12 years in a large research project on children's nutrition, so that it helped create better products, right? Because they create baby formula, they create candy, they create yogurts, dairy products, etc. So they wanted to make sure that they knew how to create better products, but they also wanted to share all that information in these large reports with parents, so they understood that yes, children really need calcium, right? What does calcium do for children, right? Children also really need green leafy vegetables, right? And vitamin D and all these different nutrients. So while that maybe is straightforward for us at the time, this wasn't necessarily common information. And so Nestle took on the burden, right? Because it was their own responsibility. They paid for this research project all on their own, right? Millions of dollars that went into this research project, hiring the scientists, bringing scientists on in-house, communicating with different people who needed this information, etc. And the idea was that at the end of the day, they would be more enlightened with also self-interest in mind. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of chapter 3. I will stop the video here and give you a break, and then I will create a separate video for part 2.